All right, welcome everyone to the first in a long time video on Declu's Views channel. Today I am joined by two of my former colleagues at Word on Fire, Andrew Petiprin and Robert Mixa, also goes by Bobby. It's great to see you guys again. Welcome on.
Likewise, Richard.
Yeah, good to see you, Richard. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, so although this video has nothing to do with Word on Fire, this is just on my own private YouTube channel. That is how we met. We were all worked together at the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm always happy to talk with y'all and touch base again and reconnect. Y'all have had me on twice on your own platform, which is what we're here to talk about. I wanted to kind of give some more exposure to your Spe Salvi Institute and introduce it to my viewers, just so more people become aware of it and take advantage of the many great offerings you have on there. Your conversations with each other and your different interviews. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of introduce the Spe Salvi Institute and sort of, just let us know what it's all about, what the reason for founding it is, and what you are seeking to do with it. So if Bobby, did you want to take it from there?
Yeah, I'll start. This kind of the idea for this came when we were at that time working at Word on Fire Institute. Andrew and I were basically neighbors in the Dallas office, and we just would always have conversations that were very fruitful conversations during lunch, and then sometimes on the side, and we just became great friends. And when Andrew and I decided to leave Word on Fire, it struck me as, what? I think that actually out of this relationship, this conversation, and I was going to be heading off to Kraków, Poland, where my wife is from, that actually I think there's something that should continue. I don't think this is supposed to be confined to the conversations that we are having, but this is actually, I think, pointing in the right direction in terms of actually having something to offer people that I think is it would perhaps be something like a charism for us, an apostolate in the church. So one day I remember it was like a couple of days or maybe weeks after we weren't at Word on Fire anymore. I think I called Andrew, and I was playing around with this title. I was really into just reading Pope Benedict's writings at the time, because earlier in that year, it was 2023. Was it New Year's? Was it New Year's Eve that Pope Benedict died on 2022? So I remember I was reading Spe Salvi encyclical around the time of his death, and I just was like, man, this is such a treasure trove. And it's like one of these encyclicals many people don't really reference and talk about much, but I feel like all the things I was thinking about when I was working at Word on Fire Institute are actually expressed here, and some of the concerns like around the kind of the interesting times that we're in are actually laid out by Ratzinger. In some ways, he felt to me like a prophet, and so I called Andrew, and I just said, hey, man, I took the name Spe Salvi, which I feel like is kind of like, it's like almost like a map and blueprint being laid out for a certain vision. And in many respects, I feel like it's a visionary project because in that encyclical, I believe that Pope Benedict, with Christian humanism in many respects, is responding to a lot of the other competing visions with more secular visions that were on offer in modernity. And I felt like, it seems like a grand project to maybe respond to those competing visions of modernity. And by visionary, I mean like the visions that could actually really inspire and almost inculcate hope in people, such as the visions of, say, Hegel and Marx. And I felt like Europe in some ways exhausted itself with those projects in recent history. And I was going to Europe, and particularly a place, Poland, where you feel like people are still going to church, but still they're in the drama of European history. And Europe is so much kind of our cultural homeland, as different as we are. as Americans, that I felt like, okay, we need to devote some project to that. And so I called Andrew. I said, Andrew, I don't know what this is going to be completely, but these conversations that we had also about film and the arts, and also like not trying to necessarily speak to like the masses, but doing this kind of niche thing that I feel it's the type of content that I would want to tune into. And then with the potential at the time, I was kind of thinking, heck, man, I've been to Poland so many times. I'm always seeing these things here that like oftentimes almost in some ways enhance my appreciation for the church that a lot of Europeans were in some ways forgetful of, that I feel like, heck, by going to these places, you can almost in a way awaken and remember so much of the richness that we already have. And so, and some of that stuff is already even in things like the film that you may not even associate with the faith, but it's there kind of implicitly. And so, Andrew, and I'll throw it to you, Andrew, but I just had this kind of vision, to be honest with you, and I felt compelled. I went to prayer with it a lot, thinking, oh, is this just some kind of ego trip? And perhaps, you never know for sure, but it's just trying to kind of like, thinking, oh, maybe I'm just trying to kind of like stay in the game, or Word on Fire, oh, got to move on, but I want to stay. But I felt like compelled. And in all honesty, that inspiration hasn't even died down. I just, in some ways, I'm still inspired, and I think there's something there to offer. So that's why Andrew and I, even though it's kind of a slow coming, because both of us have full-time jobs on the side of this, and I'm not on the side. I mean, we have full-time jobs, so we do this on the side, and we have grand vision, and we'd like to implement finally these the actual programs and some actual like travel that I still feel inspired by that. So Andrew, let me just throw it back to you. Maybe you want to say some more.
Yeah, well, there's a cliche, right, that a couple of guys have a series of interesting conversations, and then the conclusion is, let's have a podcast,
Yeah.
that the whole world is going to want to know what we have to say. So we, I guess, decided to not worry about whether we were living a cliche and do it anyway, because I believe that the conversations that we're interested in having, the kind that we were having even before we were recording them, are not quite like most of the conversations, as you said, Bobby, that are going on out there. And so the ones that we have with each other, and then the ones that we have with guests, who are mostly just friends of ours, like you, Richard, or are, just kind of fellow travelers that we've encountered along the way, we really feel like if people were to kind of open the doors of the little library that we have created so far, they would find a collection of conversations there, and to some lesser extent, a collection of writings, which we've put on our website, which are kind of exploring ideas in the space of faith and culture that isn't all that mainstream. And years ago, before I was even Catholic, I read an article in First Things by of all people, a Jewish technology scholar, David Galertner. I don't know if you know this article, but in this article, and Bobby and I have talked about this several times, maybe we have too, Richard, but in this article, this is back in the early days of the Francis pontificate. And he's just kind of, he's not Catholic, he's Jewish, he works in academia, but he's just kind of observing what Christians and particularly Catholics are doing. And he basically said, look, Pope Francis, go to the Philippines, go to Africa. That's all fine. Go to the places where the faith is alive. That's good. But what you really need to do is go stand in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, or you need to go stand in Trafalgar Square and you need to preach there, because even this non-Catholic is what was kind of cognizant of the fact that there is this inextricable link between the West, and in particular, the kind of European heritage that different parts of the West may or may not still value, and the kind of message of the gospel that has proliferated throughout the whole world. So Bobby and I think, are just very interested in continuing to, even if they're just little embers, just really trying to stoke those up where the links persist between kind of European culture and the traditional proclamation of the gospel. And what we're about is not blood and soil. We ourselves have had, it feels like one day I'm listening to a kind of classical liberal, and I think, yes, this person is so right on. And then the next day I'll be listening to one of the post liberals, and I think, oh yes, this person is so right on. So I guess we could say, or maybe I'll just speak for myself, that maybe I'm agnostic when it comes to various aspects of kind of political organization and all those sorts of things. I love my country. I love the countries that my ancestors came from. But in some respects, like, we're just exploring some of those questions as kind of ancillary to these bigger questions about culture and faith. And so I think, having a good time, Bobby, just kind of not really being overly worried about, prioritizing growth, but just kind of continuing to plow the field and kind of, do the work and see where it all may go.
Yeah, that's great. So just to make sure that I sort of am on the right track, and part of this is based on what you guys just said, but also my prior understanding. So there is this certain emphasis on Europe and European culture that the Spe Salvi Institute has, and sort of in recognition of the fact that European culture was tremendously shaped and impacted by Catholicism. And the vestiges and traces of that heritage are still very palpable. I mean, if you're an American who's ever gone over to Europe, I mean, for us, it's just, especially as a devout Catholic coming from America, you go over to Europe and like, oh my goodness, like the history, the architecture, all the churches and the religious art. And you just sort of think of how a lot of the greatest aspects of our Catholic culture, which is sort of, transcends the individual cultures within Europe. So much of our Catholic culture comes from Europe, a Catholicized Europe. And so for us, it's like going back in time and seeing all of this great patrimony that we have. And then at the same time, there's this juxtaposition between the external persistence of that art and architecture and music, and then sort of the lack of faith you encounter in actual Europeans who, despite the fact that they are living in this European culture, which is imbued with Catholic symbolism, nevertheless, so many people in Europe have lost the faith, and it's become nothing more than perhaps a cultural thing. Mm-hmm. Like, well, I'm Catholic because I'm Italian or Irish, not because I actually believe in the Trinity and the institution of the Church by Christ. And, baptism has become sort of like, well, this is just a cultural celebration we do as good Spaniards. It has nothing to do with real faith. And so tell me if I'm wrong, but sort of what I understand is there's a sort of an emphasis on trying to reawaken the reality of the faith expressed in the symbols you find in Europe, and get them to see this cultural heritage they have as more than just trappings like that. Yeah. No, like, you guys need to take your Catholic ancestry seriously and allow the external beauty that has come out of your cultures to reawaken your soul as Europeans, and to sort of similar to what Pope St. John Paul II's idea of the new evangelization. Is that sort of a decent?
Yeah. I would say a lot of this kind of came too when I was a college student. I studied abroad in Madrid. I was there for like 7 months, and I wasn't really hanging out much with with Americans, but like a lot of Spanish guys, and none of them went to church. But I was at that stage of my life, I wasn't like the most devout Catholic, but nevertheless, in the surroundings, I was just noticing all these things in my environment that they just passed by. And it just really, in a way, I couldn't believe it. And so it got me really interested in like the meaning of the symbols, the meaning of, why is it built this way and not this way? That everything seems to be a matter just of pure utility. And so there's like almost like a different world you're in. And then the second kind of thing is that when I used to go to the Center for Ethics and Culture, I remember this lecture that Alistair McIntyre gave, in which I forget the actual context in which he's using this, but the story always stuck with me that there's a guy in Northern Ireland, and he's stopped in the streets by one of these, Irish gangs, and they ask him, Protestant or Catholic? And he says, atheist. And then they say, Protestant atheist or Catholic atheist? And, it was, I think, on a talk on secularism, but that always struck me that actually, kind of like when you look at it, and you also look at some of the way philosophy is done if you want to say, in a world that was shaped by, say, maybe a Calvinist or a different form of Protestantism, as opposed to one that still had a culture of Catholicism or even Orthodoxy. There's just a different, if you want to say, worldview that still, in a way, continues in the way people live today. And so I think as an American, it's actually quite an opportunity to help those Europeans to awaken to what is around them, what they already have. It's like you're kind of like shedding light on these things for them to recognize for the first time. And I mean, I could tell you as a teacher, I'm teaching mainly, almost all my students are European. A lot of them are Polish, and I'm not going to elevate Poland and say, like, I just was reading something the other day where a guy said, oh, these young men in America are just, they have this, idolizing Eastern Europe. No, there's a lot of issues here, but nevertheless, what I'm noticing in the classroom, and I teach in a very kind of secular environment with kids who've like traveled, I mean, you wouldn't believe, but like traveled the world, but never have stepped in a church in Krakow, when there's a church, almost like 3 churches on every single street that you're on. And, but once you point out these things to them, it actually sparks an interest. And they see that actually there is like, maybe this rich symbolism is pointing to something more. We start our manifesto, I don't know why, but I love Roxy music. And I know it's maybe like, it's not like some kind of like high art. Well, you could argue that Roxy music maybe is high art, but that song, More Than This, No, There's Nothing. That's like, I feel like, and Pope Benedict talked about this a lot, this kind of like immanent frame, maybe that's Charles Taylor's language, but, we've so instrumentalized reason that we've, in a way, cut off these wings of like transcendence that we've had. And so we in some ways, we don't really soar towards these heights that, that the human soul is ordered to. And so what I've noticed in my students is these symbols that are all around them actually are conducive to that flight. And so I felt like part of my goal is kind of just being like, almost like a guide and just pointing this out to them. And so one of the things that Andrew and I, just not only in our conversations with pointing out things maybe that are going on in the culture, but also like ultimately would love to just bring people to these places and then point them out, Americans, Europeans, but there's such a richness that it would be horrible to say that we've just completely forgotten these things. And despite the fact that, that forgetfulness, I'm not like a pessimist, like maybe like our forgetfulness is absolute, but we have the church and we have the continuation of the tradition that, there's so that it can come alive again. And I mean, because it's living, it's not dead, it's living. And so, if I could say one thing, I mean, I really think that we're trying to like hone in on the Christian synthesis that we saw that the church is, the Christian synthesis. And DC Schindler, who's a good friend of ours, who I actually talked to yesterday, he talks about the kind of Jewish the Roman and the Greek synthesis that Christianity had brought about, and particularly in Rome, this kind of like going back to this the extension too of how Roman we are, in the sense that the city has expanded, and that civitas that has shaped so much of our institutions, educational and otherwise, is, in a way, I mean, we just want to help. And I think those institutions are in crisis today, and maybe rightfully so, with the direction that they've gone in perhaps modernity. But nevertheless, and maybe Andrew, you want to get into this a little bit more, there's still like like, in a way, the marks of the church are still there and apparent. And as Nietzsche saw, they don't make any sense without that.
Yeah. There's a part right at the beginning of Spe Salvi where Pope Benedict says that the Christian message is not only informative but performative. And I think that as Americans, even American Catholics tend to think of evangelism. They tend to think of kind of the way faith is kind of passed on and preserved, with the exception of kind of those strong kind of like ethnic identity markers that do exist in some places. But again, those are kind of from the old world. So hold on to that thought. But I tend to think that your typical American mentality is more informative than performative, in the sense that if we think of a performative Christianity, we think of it in terms of like individual displays of virtue, maybe. Like, so if somebody is kind, well, then that's a good advertisement for the gospel. But I think what Bobby and I are trying to say, drawing from the works of people like Ratzinger, Benedict, drawing from modern thinkers who are, some of them still alive, people like Remy Brague, he also is big on the kind of the origins of our faith as this kind of Greek and Roman and Jewish and all of that. Pierre Manon, Roger Scruton, I mean, even further back, T.S. Eliot, Charles Péguy, he's somebody we quote in our manifesto, is really thinking in terms of this performative aspect of our faith is not just about individual behavior, but it is about the marks of the culture itself. And so this leads us then as Americans to kind of speak back to people who are, in Europe now, and kind of try to draw attention to the gifts that they have that maybe they aren't appreciating enough, but then also to kind of take them back to our people. And, especially to Americans who, like it or not, are the kind of great imperial power in the world, and sort of try to kind of awaken hope through this kind of performative thing, which isn't just about kind of individual behavior. This leads Remy Brague to say about Europeanness, which is an interesting kind of whole idea, right? That we put this in our manifesto as well. He says that it is possible for someone who is not a European to become more European than those who believe themselves to be European. And in a sense, like, that's sort of what we're getting at. I liken this to how, it still happens now, but especially in the decade or two after the end of the Cold War, there would be people from, for example, Bobby Poland or the former Soviet Union or something, who would come to America, and they would say, you just don't even understand what you have here, and we would be a little, maybe we would be a little cynical about it, like, oh, whatever, everywhere is the same or whatever. And they'd say, no, it's not. Everywhere's not the same. You take it for granted what you have. And I think there's something to that we're getting at with kind of the European focus that we have. And we've been criticized a little bit by maybe, one or two people who pay attention to us and don't love everything that we do, about kind of focusing on that as if we're kind of limiting our scope. But hey, we're happy for people to kind of lift up the reality of the explosion of the faith in the global South and so on. That's all great. But I would just sort of say back to them, look at someone like Cardinal Sarah, for example, who, when asked, what do you make of the fact that kind of you're a Christian and your people are Christian because of colonialism or something? And his response back is, God loves Africa. I mean, it's just, so, I mean, so we want to kind of say back to that. I mean, despite all of the potential, problems that we could kind of enumerate, our faith is a gift to everyone in the world. And there is a kind of Europeanness about it that, like it or not, is still very much there. So why not kind of point to that a little bit and accentuate the gifts that are embedded in that reality?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of great points there. Like you said, it's not uncommon. I've lived in several major cities, and there can be a tendency of locals to sort of take for granted that the cultural things available to them are just always there, so they actually never end up going. Because it's always right around the corner. I can go at any time, and that ends up being never. But
Richard, I have to interject really quickly and tell you, I lived in Arizona for 14 months and didn't go to the Grand Canyon. So there's a great example right there. It's just to my shame.
Yeah, you're like, oh, I'll get to that later, and yet people flock to those areas in order to see the things that you could see, but you're not, and that can be true of cities. It can be true of homes. Like if you have someone that grew up in a mansion or something, they might not actually appreciate all the things that they have. Because it's like, well, isn't this just normal? Like to them, it's just an everyday thing, and sometimes it does take an outsider to say, look, guys, like you've got a lot of treasures here and you're not appreciating it. You're taking it for granted, and there's another point though I want to make, because I think, that charge of being too Eurocentric, first of all, well, why doesn't Europe also, deserve evangelization and to be reminded of its treasures? But it actually reminds me of something that Pope Benedict said, as Ratzinger, when he's writing his Spirit of the Liturgy, he talks about sacred music, and he sort of makes a point about Europe in this regard, when he's like, because some people can tend to think, well, that's just European, like that architecture style or that music style or this, that, or the other thing. And he makes the point, it's like, yeah, but it's a European culture that has been transformed by Catholicism. When we talk about enculturation, the church always says that it involves not just mere adaptation, but also purifying.
Yeah.
And that it has to inform the culture. Like the culture needs to be shaped by the Catholicism that it's receiving. And so it's not purely dressing up Catholicism, whatever happens to be there. It's a discerning process that requires some culling of what is not in line with the gospel. And through that process, in other words, his point was you have to Christianize the culture first before it can be made suitable for the liturgy. You don't just throw things in the liturgy because they're from that culture. It does take this discernment in this purification process. And one of his examples was sacred music. He's like, that music was Christified before it was adopted. It was created as sacred music within a Catholic context. And from that perspective, then, what we now consider just to be European culture with the art and the architecture and those, classical music forms, his point is like, yeah, but that's actually Catholic because it's been Catholicized first. And because of that, it gives us an example of what it means to enculturate properly. Yeah. I'm expanding on that a little bit, but the whole notion is it's not just European.
Yeah. And Richard, can I jump in too? Like Pope Benedict, he gave us famous, I don't think it's famous enough, but a talk in Paris. And I believe it's, I don't know if it's St. Bernard's College, but anyways, he gave it to like the, I think in Paris, they have this like college of like the topmost recognized scholars. And everybody thought he was going to give a talk on culture. And the whole time he just talked about this Carrere Deum, I think, seeking God above all things. And what he said was, I thought really interesting, that It wasn't the purpose wasn't to create a culture. It was seek God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. And that's first, the priority of God. And then, like, without even thinking about it, that takes form, a culture takes form out of that. And it may take form depending on the geography, the people, the history. It's going to have a unique form. But like, and this is the Christian kind of humanism thing there, just as like, in the God man, the humanity is elevated and is enhanced, to its true destiny by putting the priority of God. And it's precisely in the person, in the divine person, that the humanity then comes forth. That the cultures then will do that as well. And so, like, and that's why the kind of the forgetfulness of that, and the cultures then end up, like, once they're disconnected from that, or the forget, and once you have the eclipse of God and the forgetfulness of God, then the cultures end up kind of dying and dwindling. I mean, and they're not even culture. I mean, it's still a cult. You always still will have a cult, but it's then just this kind of like a culture that totally lacks a contemplative dimension. And so, like, this kind of contemplative dimension, I think, like, Andrew and I are kind of trying to, like, focus in on that as, like, the priority. And so it's not like you see a lot of these initiatives, and I hope I'm not critical of anyone here. I don't think people are doing this, but you always hear these things like, hey, we have to create Catholic culture. You don't just create that. It's not like, it's like creating a family culture. You don't say, hey guys, we're going to create a family culture. No, there's out of some kind of like practice that you do, that takes form. And it also doesn't lead to by theorizing about it all the time, so it's not like just an intellectual endeavor, but it involves your whole heart, the entirety, where you encounter the person of the Lord. And that's what's there. So sorry, maybe if I cut you off there, but I just wanted to throw that in there. I encourage everybody to go take a look at that speech by Pope Benedict.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And it sort of reminds me of another point. It actually goes back to what I think you were saying earlier, Andrew. I think it was you. Well, both of you, I think, brought it up. But this, I think Bob had brought it up, and then Andrew was confirming it. The Christian synthesis of the Jewish, Greek, and the Roman. And some people can look at that and think, oh, well, then that's just like accidental, right? It just happened to take place in these places, and that's where. And Pope Benedict didn't think that at all. He thought it was providential. Mm-hmm. Like this is part of God's plan. And because of that, the European aspect of the faith is not something that is just disposable.
Right.
He saw, in particular, like even with the writing of the late Old Testament and the New Testament, in this meeting of the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman minds as something that was actually part of God's providence, and that it's not accidental at all, and that ancient Greek philosophy, was not accidentally adopted within the church, but actually is part of God's plan. And this synthesis of those cultures into sort of this culture that sort of unites them, is a beautiful thing that, again, is something that God willed, and is not, obviously, with purification. We don't just adopt. There's a lot of things in Greek culture and in Roman culture in particular that needed to be cast aside in this purification process. And the Jewish roots of Catholicism remain fundamental to Catholicism as well. And all of our sacraments, the Old Testament prefigurements and all of that. But I guess the very name of the institute you guys have, the Spe Salvi Institute, obviously taken from the encyclical, the hope that saves, from Pope Benedict XVI. And I think that's important that the word hope's in there, because let's be honest, it's quite easy to look at modern culture in the West and think, well, it's pretty hopeless right now. There are signs of hope, I think, in pockets here and there, but it can be pretty easy to lose that hope. And I think, one of the things that you guys are catching on to is like, look, there are tools already present in these areas where this decline is happening. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's like we need to remind them of what they already have and use the tools that are sort of in the attic and bring them back out and show them again and reveal, re-expose them to the deep meaning that's behind their own cultural heritage, and help them see that in many ways it's so much greater than the culture that's being built now, and I think, and it's not antiquarianism for the sake of antiquarianism. I think it's really a call to a self-examination, that, one of my favorite movies is Saving Private Ryan. And it's, at the end of the movie when he's crying with his being surrounded by his family that would not exist had they not saved him, he's thinking back to the words of Tom Hanks's character who said, "Earn this," and he's like, "Tell me I've been a good man. Tell me that I've lived a good life, that I've made their sacrifice worth it." Mm-hmm. I think in some ways what y'all are doing is trying to awaken that in European culture itself and Western culture more broadly, which is European in its roots, is that, are we living lives? Are we developing our culture in a way that honors the tremendous gifts that we have from the past? Mm-hmm. And let's do a serious cultural examination of conscience. Like, what would our ancestors think if they were transported to us today? Would they see what we're currently going through as real progress? And should we think, because modern day progress is like this, catchword. Oh, we're so progressive. And it's like, but are we? Mm-hmm. Really, have we really developed our humanity? Are we real? Just because we're more technologically advanced doesn't mean we're more culturally advanced, and it doesn't mean we're more morally advanced. It doesn't mean we're even more intelligent. I still hold, I say it somewhat tongue in cheek, but part of me thinks that humanity peaked in the 13th century. And if modern academics think that they are more intelligent than the high scholastics of the 13th century, I'm sorry, but yeah, I would love to see modern academics try to go toe-to-toe in one of these medieval disputations in the university, and see how well they fare. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or an architect building a church. I mean, there's no way there. I mean, I think you would have to be, either so just ideologically captured or just insane to point to some modern church building and say that it's comparable to Notre Dame, right? I mean, right. So there is a narrative which I'm not totally unsympathetic to, that does say it was better before. That said, we do, I think anyway, Bobby, correct me if I'm saying this inelegantly, but I think we do want to avoid the narrative of decline, because there are also demonstrated moments of real renewal that we can point to in the history of the West. Obviously, there's something to be said about the grandeur of the faith, its edifices, and so on in the Middle Ages. But, there did come a moment when people started going to Rome and looking around, and kind of, you see this in, for example, in like French poetry in the 15th and 16th centuries. Like, these guys go there and they're looking around and they're actually like reflecting publicly in their art on the idea that Rome, that the ruins of that antiquity is ruins now, right? And so then the idea is, well, what about antiquity the ruins of which I'm standing in, can I rebuild? Like what can be refound that then will kind of not replace but complement Notre Dame and polyphony or like whatever, right? Now some of that goes wrong in intellectually in the Reformation and whatever, it goes wrong again in various ways, centuries later in the Enlightenment and then in the Industrial Revolution or whatever that is. But embedded in all of these moments, there are places, I guess, to co-opt the language of kind of like progress or regress. I would say there are arguably moments of progress, like even though we are ultimately kind of wringing our hands about demise otherwise. And a place in history that Bobby and I both think a lot about with regard to our own moment or potential for renewal here, and as we get deeper into the 21st century, is a place about 100 years ago in Europe, where after World War I and the end of Christendom, people were trying to figure out how to put an imperium back together, a spiritual imperium anyway, even if we're going to decide we're not going to be Christian kingdoms anymore and we're going to be republic or whatever that's going to be. That's where you get Charles Piggy. That's where you get T.S. Eliot. That's where you get the Abendland movement. That's where you get things like the what's his name, Sertiage, the intellectual life. You get like these sort of like things that are kind of popping up like that, right? Now that was all kind of like obliterated by the diabolical Third Reich. And then we had the Cold War, and then it went on and on. I happen to believe that there's something to pick up again, that it isn't actually just being an antiquarian to go back and say, look, there's something from 100 years ago that is really quite unresolved, that we think probably could speak to some of the challenges that we're facing today. I mean, going back just 20 years before that, though, we've got Rerum Novarum, and we've got these attempts at responding to modernity. Pope Leo XIV has already signaled that there are aspects of that project that he thinks are unresolved, and that, or at any rate, can be contributed to again in the 21st century. And so all of that is just to say, I think to focus on hope, the theological virtue of hope, seems to us completely natural, because that's always what our Western forebears have, in a sense, been pinning a lot on as they kind of try to make sense of how to continue not only to be Christian individuals, but a Christian people. And I just don't think it's being an authentic Christian to not hope for the possibility of being a Christian people. And that does sound a little old-fashioned, but I think when we parse it out, kind of the way I've been trying to do here, it's pretty sensible.
Yeah, maybe I could say something too on this, like with hope and not being a too pessimist or an optimist, but in maybe somewhat maybe pessimistically hopeful. I mean, I don't know how best to put that. George Grant, the great Canadian thinker, has a great way of putting it. So I encourage everybody to take a look at how he talks about being a maybe pessimistically hopeful. But what I was thinking too in Spe Salvi, it's interesting how actually Pope Benedict approaches the moment that we're in. In so many ways, he's continuing, I think, an analysis that Henri de Lubac was doing in terms of kind of trying to understand the if you want to say the genealogy of the modern world. But he doesn't go off and elaborate on it and go into some speculation like maybe somebody like a Balthazar would, but Ratzinger, with kind of being indebted to Henri de Lubac, in a way, like this kind of rediscovery of what's in the church, going back to the sources. But even like with kind of like looking at the words itself, in the beginning of Spe Salvi, he mentions that, the hope is the substance, or faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the close relation between hope and faith, and how he talks about substance here is it's all, in some ways it's the how does he exactly put it, Andrew? But it's like the substance is already here. I mean, what we have put our hope in, the reality that Christ has made, has the grace that he has brought us into, it's already but not yet, in some sense. So this tension. So I don't want to err on the side of, like, somebody who, and this gets into some of the stuff about, hope and then presumption and about, salvation, but there's still this kind of drama that we're in, but we're already in it. In terms of we've already reached the eschaton. It has become realized, but yet at the same time, that has been founded in the past, and that kind of wellspring from the past of the death, the incarnation, the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ it continues to be that reality. And so it's not like, I think having the Catholic dimension to it is really important to this, because you oftentimes will find people who are kind of like, falling into despair, or they're just overly cultural, they're optimists, but yet they don't ground it in that substance at the end of the day. And so I think that's like sometimes missing in a lot of these, if you want to say, this cultural analysis that goes on, because they see the faith oftentimes, I feel like, in terms of like subjective terms, and Pope Benedict talks about this. It's like, when he talks about what Luther did, where it's like faith becomes, how does he exactly put it? It's your almost like kind of like a subjective disposition.
Your interior attitude, he talks about.
Interior attitude. And that even comes in, he talks about it, that the German bishops at one point even pick up that language. But Andrew, I don't have the text in front of me right now, but what does he say?
Well, the very section that you're talking about is really interesting, because he says faith draws the future into the present so that it is no longer simply a not yet. And this is really interesting. And this is where I think Catholics really do have a very particular thing to share, especially those of us who would identify more on the conservative side, because there's this kind of conservative platitude which says don't immanentize the eschaton, right? That immanentizing the eschaton is a kind of utopian way of thinking, which is what the left do. And that leads to this sort of dangerous fairy tale living that can ultimately be used as a kind of a manipulative source of power that opportunists can then impose upon, docile or passive people. And maybe, people of faith are particularly susceptible to this, right? Because we want to be striving for things that are better or whatever, but when they never come, well, then our overlords can just sort of keep reminding us that we've never arrived. We're not getting there. We got to keep moving. Meanwhile, they're enjoying all kinds of material benefits that we're not, right? But the true Christian viewpoint is that we're not immanentizing the eschaton. The kingdom has come. And so then, but then the question is, how does the past, and you're much sharper on all of this, Richard, than I am, and probably than we are. Although I think I'm third on the ladder on kind of on this eschatology stuff. But I mean that ultimately, like we always want to, even as we're kind of working to improve our institutions and like thinking in terms of, what it would look like to have a baptized society, in terms of like what that would mean for our social structures and all kinds of stuff like that. The sky's the limit. We can have all kinds of intellectual exercises and then figure out how we might apply those things. But none of it is worth anything if it isn't rooted in the, in the kingdom, which is to come and has come, right? And so there's where I think Ratzinger is so brilliant, and where his writings on Europe, on the world, on, just the state of everything in the modern world is, we believe, and I think you'll agree, Richard, just like greatly underappreciated. I mean, we really believe he's just one of the key voices that has to go into the conversation as we're thinking as Christians about how we're thinking of the future.
Yeah, no, I like that, because I tend to, think of Ratzinger Benedict as sort of being in the sapiential tradition, and by that, and he would share this, the Thomists would share this view, but this notion that wisdom is sort of seeing the whole, and therefore the parts in light of the whole, and in many ways judging lower things from the vantage point of higher things.
Yeah.
Okay, and putting the actual real eschaton as sort of like the putting last things first, actually, is another way of putting it. Dr. Casarello once made an argument for why eschatology should be taught first in the dogmatics courses. But for that reason, like the end is, you have to have the goal in mind in order to know what's an appropriate way of attaining that goal. Right?
Yeah.
Your proximate goals have to be aligned with the ultimate goal, the final goal.
Yeah.
The stops you take on a journey have to be headed in the right direction.
And that, Richard, if you don't mind my interrupting, that's where the word hope becomes so important in Spe Salvi, because what Pope Benedict is concerned about is that we're putting too much weight on the lesser hopes, right? On the stops rather than the destination. But if we're focused on the great hope, then the lesser hopes are all the more valuable, are all the more important, actually, to kind of strive for those things too. So just to reinforce what you're saying.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, Richard.
It's fine.
But I was talking to DC Schindler about some of this stuff yesterday, because he talks about how in Plato's Republic, and I know we're with the pagans now, but it's kind of anticipating some of this. In Plato's Republic, it's the work where you have the best expression of his political philosophy, maybe, and his metaphysics. Okay, and many people view the two as kind of two separate things, but no, they coincide there, and they're actually the one who bears witness then to the ultimate, the philosopher king, the one who in some ways has this martyr kind of like dimension, bearing witness to the ultimate, is then what then gives the one who is able to in a way shed the light into the cave and to then lead the others. And it always has to be freely chosen, the truth that is accepted. But like you said, there's this, in some ways, from our perspective, it's the kind of the ultimate end, which is for him, the good beyond being. I mean, I know Plato's a little bit different here than how we think about it, but that ultimate end, like you said, Richard, the goal has to in some ways be provided first, to then make sense of the whole endeavor to begin with. And what we see, I think, Andrew, if we could say this, is that has been eclipsed, and that's why, like as Schindler said, that Sarah O'Regan recently talked about Friedrich Nietzsche's parable of the madman and the wiping clean of the horizon as there being a disaster. And literally the disaster is like the stars no longer are our guides. And then we're just completely lost, and up is no longer up or down, and you're just lost in the cosmos. And Ratzinger ends the Spe Salvi with pointing to Mary, and he says the star of Mary, the star of the sea. And so we kind of see, I think, and you find this expressed in European culture through Poland, like with the Marian shrines, Our Lady of Czestochowa, pilgrimages. Now it's even taking up, people are doing it in France again with going to Chartres. And you think of just in the life of Pagui, who makes his great pilgrimage to Mary as being that guide, the star, who in some ways can guide, if you want to say the entire, not only your personal life, but the culture as a whole. So I'm sorry for cutting you off there, but I love that, the last things first. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's a beautiful reflection on that. Yeah, I think is, and just to sort of shift gears a little bit, one thing that just came to my mind, I don't know if it was earlier today or yesterday, but was kind of thinking, how do we have hope for the future as far as like rebuilding a culture? I think one, as Andrew was saying, there's already signs of hope. It's not like it's always been lost. It's not just been a steady decline. There's always like these ebbs and flows and, signs of hope here and there. And we're seeing massive public conversions to the faith, all that sort of thing. But it also sort of struck me, there was a time when, in some sense, in the liberal 60s and 70s, right, the charge of those who were still more traditional in values was that, well, you only think that way because that was your culture, right? Like you're just reflecting, the environment in which you grew up. And I've always thought that's a little bit ironic because it's not like the people of the 60s and 70s were any less influenced by that. And certainly not the case that people of today are not influenced by their environment. Because a lot of things that people nowadays take for granted as just obvious really are only that way because their environment tells them it is. And under scrutiny, it becomes pretty apparent that no, it's not obvious at all. And it was not obvious for most of human history. And that should require some discernment. Like, do these certain things that are really novel make actual sense or not? And don't just presuppose that they do. But anyway, the reason that I saw that as somewhat of a sign of hope is that, hearkening back to Aquinas's epistemology, the idea that we're sort of our mind is a tabula rasa, is that, well, really what it takes to help change a culture really is just forming the minds of the little ones, which is where education, I think, definitely plays a huge role. And I do think that there are signs of hope that in the younger generations, they're starting to see some of the insanity for what it is. And they're sort of primed to receive a message that shows them, no, there really is meaning to life. And, atheism is not the most rational thing on the block. And the higher transcendental values are not mirages. They are real. And in some ways, they're actually more real than the subatomic particles that make up the cosmos. And that not everything is just fact. There actually is real meaning, and value is a reality. It's not just the product of random chemical processes in the brain. And I think they're primed to see that and to see that there must be real meaning and value in the world around them. And that part of what makes, one of you sort of hinted at this earlier, but what makes the human mind so valuable and dignified is precisely the fact of its ability to abstract out of the concrete material world transcendental values that are reflected therein, and to perceive that which is not merely material, spatial, temporal. And the fact that the mind is capable of perceiving those eternal truths, so to speak, is part of, and this is something that Benedict was really big on. He's like, no, we need to rediscover the tremendous capacity of the human intellect to know things and stop reducing it to mere facticity.
Yeah.
All the time.
I would just say too, an important connecting point to that is that we believe that, we have, there's no shortcuts to doing that. You have to do that work yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a renewal of the intellectual life, even if we're not saying everybody needs to be a bona fide intellectual, we nonetheless believe that a renewal of the intellectual life is essential to this, precisely because I do think the opportunity is there, as you said, Richard, for people to really see and receive. But the issue is, are they looking? Are they, because literally there's so many distractions, there's so many tools, right, that are sort of useful to people for their, for achieving things. But we're actually proposing something that cannot be achieved by anything other than the individual in community pursuing it. And that's why we don't shy away from attaching the word humanist actually to our project, because we do believe, we really want to kind of emphasize the things that kind of make us who we are, and our intellect, our ability to abstract, and also to kind of live in reality is what it's all about, really.
Yeah, and it's a very incarnational way of looking at it too. Ratzinger, I believe it was in Intro to Christianity, deals with the whole objection to Christianity. He's like, well, how can the life of one man have anything to do with the salvation of all of humans throughout history? And it's the scandal of particularity, so to speak. But he sort of just talks about how, well, that's sort of just the way things must be. Like there's a certain sense in which there has to be, because of the nature of man as an embodied spirit, all these things have to take place through a particularity. Not, he's more of a Platonist than an Aristotelian, but in a certain sense, all knowledge comes through sensibility. And the way God's going to reveal himself is through sensible things, like his word and his deeds and history. And then that's conveyed through scripture and tradition. And that's sort of, he has to meet man where he's at. And where is man? He's in an embodied historical reality. Like he's an historical creature, and this is how these things are going to take place. And I think that goes back to the whole cultural element, because it's like these things have to take on a particular historical form, right? Whether you're 6 feet tall or 5'6" like I am, or 7 feet tall, those might be accidental, but you can't have a human body without one of them. Like it has to take on a specific size. So even the accidents in some sense are still part of the nature. They're still essential insofar as they're part of the integral nature. I was talking on another interview recently about this. I'm like, yes, technically, could this culture have developed slightly differently? And, yeah, but then you've been asking the same question. Well, why did it develop that way and not another way? Like it has to take on a certain way. And, and I think that goes back to the whole potency and act thing. There's a lot of potentialities out there, but until one of them is realized, nothing's real. Like it has to be actualized in a given manner, in a particular time and place, and take on the limitations of a particularity in order to become real. And sort of what you guys are saying is, this needs to be embodied and lived out in the concrete. And that it's not, yes, it's a little, because we're talking about these as big ideas, but then you're saying, but then actually do something with it. Like put this in that practice and action. And it doesn't just stay on the level of ideas. It can become something that's embodied and lived, and made real. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that it will take on particularities. That's just part of the exigencies of what it means to be living a human life, and a sanctified human life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think responding to the scandal of particularity, and also to the kind of universalisms that you find in maybe the modern project that Ratzinger is critiquing, is part of what we're doing. So, I have to say a lot of this, kind of the formation of, under Bishop Barron in many respects, I have to say, like, his great project of basically saying, hey, look, just look. I think he opens up his book, I forget what it's called, but the way, what's the one, what is it called? The Strangest Way. He opens up with I think a quote, if it's by Wittgenstein or somebody, but it's basically, you just have to, instead of actually kind of conceptualizing something, you have to let just look at the particular, and then it will in some way, and you look at this for us, and Bishop Barron does this. You look at those who do bear witness, the particular lives of the saints, and in that you find the grammar that will then shape the whole. It will be a guide for your life. It will be a guide for society. And that's, I think, in many respects, continuing in the inspiration of what Bishop Barron has done, which Bishop Barron was really much, in so many ways, drawing on Ratzinger, on Hans von Balthasar, and Henri de Lubac, trying to kind of make those things manifest again.
Yeah, excellent. So to move forward a little bit, we've sort of talked about sort of the overall ideas behind the founding of the Institute. Do you want to get into a little bit more specifics about what are some of the things you currently offer via the Institute, whether it's writings or interviews you've had? And then after that, we can kind of get into like future projects and things down the pike. But do you want to talk about like what is available for people if they check out? Well, first of all, where can they check out the Spe Salvi Institute? What venues?
Yeah.
And then what would they find there that would be of benefit?
Yeah, well, right now we have articles. It's at www.spesalviinstitute.com, and they can find a bunch of articles. Andrew has a great article up right now, a couple of them actually. You'll find the manifesto, which we lay out kind of our vision. And then the podcast section has probably like a lot of like some of the most stuff, I think. And we come out with a new podcast episode almost, sometimes we're consistent with having it come out a week. A lot depends on the people we're actually trying to interview and sometimes our own schedules. But, roughly speaking, we get maybe, like about 3 podcast interviews out a month. And those, I feel like a lot of the heart of what we're doing is there. We have a lot of projects that like a lot of ideas in mind. Andrew, I don't know if you want to pick up from what I just said, what's already offered.
Well, I would just add, I was on a podcast the other day where the host was, asked me a little bit about this, about Spe Salvi Institute, but also kind of told me what he thought. He told me what he thought we did, and he said, in his opinion, the 3 C's of Spe Salvi Institute are Catholicism, civilization, and cinema, which I took as a particular compliment because, as you know, Richard, I myself am a big cinephile, and a lot of my writing has been about cinema as an art form and its relation to faith and culture more broadly. So, yeah, we're definitely interested in, deep theological questions. We talk to people like you. We write our own little reflections that are pretty, just basically kind of theological reflections. We have people like D.C. Schindler on. We've had Robert and Belly. We've had other kind of like bona fide theologians come on our show, but we also have had a number of kind of pundits, commentators, cultural critics, that kind of thing. People who talk about politics, people who talk about kind of, cultural issues, civilizational issues. And then we've talked a lot about art. We've talked to novelists. We've talked to people who are interested in film as we are. We've had conversations just between the 2 of us about kind of all of these things stitched together. And I think that's kind of part of our particular gift, we hope, is that the way we address these 3 things and more are not quite like what you're going to find anyplace else.
Right. Yeah. And the whole cinema thing. I mean, obviously you have that book. Is it Popcorn with the Pope? Is that?
Yeah, Popcorn with the Pope, co-written with Michael Ward and David Paul Baird, A Guide to the Vatican Film List. I was really blessed to be a part of that. And that book has really become one that a lot of people refer to and look at. So that's been great. And I've just sort of done more of that sort of thing as well, just essays and reviews and that kind of thing also.
I probably should have started with this, but y'all do have theological background as well. I should have had you introduce yourselves at the beginning, but if you want to just tell people a little bit about your own background and education.
Well, okay, I'll go first. As you know, Richard, I used to be an Episcopal priest, and I do have an MDiv. So I've done theology at the graduate level, although I don't I don't have a doctorate in that, but I also have a master's degree from Oxford in literature, European literature, which I received before my theological training. I have a few years of classroom teaching experience, and then several years of serving as an Episcopal priest. So, yeah, my background is kind of varied in the sense of I have the practical ministry experience and some academic theology, but then also some some training in kind of the more kind of humane pursuits and the arts and that kind of thing. So that's kind of my background.
Yeah. And your MDiv is from where?
It's from Yale Divinity School.
That's what I thought. I was like, you can't leave that out. I mean, that's still.
Well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being at Yale a lot.
Yeah.
There were 3 happy years of my life. I was already married at the time, and my wife and I were there. It's an ecumenical divinity school. I mean, one might even say an interfaith at this point. I'm not quite sure. But when I was there, there were some really good teachers there. I mean, some of them are still there, but Dennis Turner was there doing medieval theology, and Miroslav Volf systematics, and I don't know, quite a few other people that I stuck to pretty closely. Christopher Bealey doing patristics. So for me, it was, I wasn't Catholic then, and I'm not sure that I would necessarily point an Orthodox Catholic in that direction, but there are probably, even to this day, worse places you could go if you want to learn a little bit of theology.
Yeah, well, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Dr. Peter Casarella also, I think he did his doctorate at Yale before. So whether it's a program people would be recommended to or not is one thing, but it has produced some good intellectuals.
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole Yale School, which was kind of very, very significant in the 20th century. By the time I got to Yale, that had pretty much gone, although I did take a seminar with David Kelsey, who was kind of a Yale School guy. I mean, most of that's liberal Protestant stuff, but it's also not just the lowest kind of form of liberal Protestantism. I mean, it is really quite high level and pretty well schooled in Catholic theology as well, actually. Like, it doesn't ultimately kind of agree with it, but I mean, the guys who are there working on, Karl Barth, for example, are people who are like pretty good on Balthasar and pretty good on de Lubac and some of those guys too, because they just, they know 20th century theology. So there's a lot to learn in a place like that.
What about you, Bobby?
Yeah, so I did an undergrad in philosophy at St. Louis University, and then I got a master's in theology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute in DC. And so, if you notice, like, we have a lot of our guests are actually professors from the Institute. And so that's where I learned about like Hans von Balthasar and then the Lubac really I worked at Word on Fire before that, but reading Communio was kind of really, the journal was what really inspired me to go to the John Paul II Institute. So it was kind of a great blessing, informative experience for me to be there. So yeah, that's my background.
Yeah, I mean, for those who might not know, the Pontifical John Paul II Institute on Marriage and Family in D.C. At the Catholic University of America, but a lot of the professors and administration of that institute are basically also the people in charge of Communio, the English language edition of Communio.
Yeah.
So
I met D.L. Schindler, like when I was still working at Word on Fire. I met him, and I took him to this. I had to drive him to the airport, and it was like 10:30 p.m. by the time he was hungry, and I took him to this dive right by the airport. It was like, it's something like, you looked like you're in something from like a disco from Boogie Nights or something. But I mean, it's hilarious. But that's where I talked with Schindler for hours about his. I mean, we spent it was a weekend night, and we spent, a weeknight, and we just spent such a long time talking about his encounters with Hans von Balthasar, and so many other people, like even visiting Ratzinger many times out in Rome. And it was just kind of that personal connection to these figures that we were studying was very special for me. So
Yeah, well, you both have excellent backgrounds, so I think that's just another reason for people to check out the Spe Salvi Institute and support it if able, and avail themselves of the great content. Is there anything in particular you're excited about, either approximately like coming up soon or long-term goals that you'd like the folks to learn about?
well, I mean, in all honesty, I mean, I really would like to get some. We have, if you go on our manifesto, we've at the bottom there, we talk about these summits of hope, having these immersive experiences in which we organize kind of these immersive experiences in various European cities, and basically like take all of the, if you want to say, the built structure and the art there as kind of being the inspiration, if you want to say an act of remembering some of the, if you want to say, the living hope that is embodied in those things. So many times you go on these tours in Krakow and they'll give you all the list of facts, but no one is there to kind of like illuminate some of the stuff that really is going on there that may bring it to life. And I think Americans at least, set out to Europe almost in pilgrimage to a cultural homeland. And you oftentimes also have pilgrimages in which you don't have that cultural component to it. And so I think what we're trying to do is bring that together and see how actually, all of this stuff is a kind of a spiritual journey. And like me back in Madrid, back in 2007, when Spe Salvi actually came out, and discovering all these things in this cultural homeland of Europe, and that being conducive to me, in many respects, taking up the practice of the faith again. That's kind of like what we want to do. And then also, I mean, Andrew's like the editor, so I really, I mean, we gotta, I think, raise money and get that going. But like having a magazine, I think Andrew would be, man, that guy. I know Andrew's right here in front of me, but I feel like if we got a nice magazine that Andrew can kind of put together, that thing would be like on every single, coffee table, taking it up, reading. I think it would be a great thing. So, and in addition to that, just continuing with podcasts and other essays. But that's, I don't know, Andrew, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I'll just add this. Yeah, I mean, I would love to get a magazine going at some point, and again, to kind of harken back to the 1920s and kind of that era, there were all these little publications that popped up that were very much about kind of pondering these questions of like Christianity and culture and society, like in the aftermath of World War I. And so I don't know. I kind of take that as something of an inspiration that we could create some kind of something like that in due course. But I've come also to think that whenever the timing is right for these things, it will be right. I have noticed that over the years that it takes a while. Something that you think you've been doing for a really long time and is really well established. Somebody that you think should have known about it will just all of a sudden go, oh, what are you doing? You run the Spe Salvi Institute. What is that? So even though we've been doing it for, a couple of years now, Bobby, I still kind of feel like we're still just like kind of not in a huge rush, because we're just building the collection, like laying the groundwork. And then when we are able to do these study, intellectual pilgrimages and or a magazine or whatever other things, they will come out into the world in a very natural way, as flowing from the stuff that we've already been doing. So it's going to happen. I know it.
Good deal. Yeah, well, I'm excited about it, and I've been doing some reading of Inter Mirifica recently, and one of the things that sort of struck me about that document, it's probably the least well studied and presented documents from Vatican II, and yet, considering how mass social media has blown up since then, maybe one of the most prescient and important. But one of the things it actually talks about is sort of the duty of Catholics to support good media outlets that are doing good work. It's sort of like, you all need to support this so that it's sustained and that it can produce good things for the culture. And precisely because mass media has the ability to form individuals and societies, that one of the ways that Catholics are called to do that is by supporting good projects. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you all on, is to, I know I still, since I don't really use my YouTube channel much anymore, but still I've got, a few thousand subscribers still clinging on, and wanted to give you guys some further exposure. So I do encourage people to check out the Spe Salvi Institute and to continue, to really consider supporting the work that you're all doing.
Hey, thanks, Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. We appreciate it.
Yeah. So with that, let's go ahead and say a prayer to close, if you don't mind, to our Blessed Mother, and trusting your endeavors to her protection and intercession. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, thank you all again, and hope to talk to you again soon. Take care, and God bless.